So it's October 31st, and I'm located just outside of Cambridge in the UK. What I wanted to speak to was on this theme, from presence to relational presence. On my spiritual path, which began, at least at a conscious level, around the age of 19, just prior, I had been introduced to a very deep encounter with Western philosophy, particularly European continental thought, such as Descartes, Nietzsche, Heidegger. Had a Professor Stephen Erickson at Pomona College who recently passed away. He was a wonderful teacher, very kind, and a deep source of inspiration for engaging in questions around what is the meaning of our life? How am I to live? Following that philosophical exploration, I had the good fortune to do a study abroad program in Nepal, in the country of Nepal, where there is so much spiritual seeking. I encountered Buddhist theory and practice. The first big insight that came to me was in reading the book, What the Buddha Taught. It's written by a South Asian Buddhist scholar and practitioner. I believe his name was Walpole Rahula. The big insight that came to me at first was his describing the thinking process as a cognitive form, just like one of the other five senses. Thinking being a way we perceive, just like the other five senses. This was striking to me because it provoked me to reflect on what I thought I knew about thinking and who I was. And it challenged even the foundational structures, at least from my point of view, of even what I had been exploring in the history of philosophy in the West. I had been seeking to understand through thinking, and now I was pointed to a perspective in which thinking was seen essentially as another one of the senses. I remember that one of the first reflections that came after that recognition was to see the way that through thought, I had constructed a separation in value between myself and animals. I had believed the argument that humans are superior or of more value than animals. And thus we had, in a sense, the right to treat animals as we wanted or to use them for our purposes. There were just some conditioned assumptions around how I created separation between humans and animals. Ethically, what that led me to do was to become a vegetarian because there was a collapse of conditioned identification with an idea or a conditioned thinking structure or process around the valuing of other beings relative to me. I'm guessing that also led to how I might have treated insects differently from that point on. Continuing on my spiritual journey, I particularly started to focus on Zen practice, which was a beautiful practice as disidentifying with this thinking mind, this conditioned mind. As that journey continued, I began to be introduced to the teachings of non-duality, which was a liberation in itself, because part of my spiritual journey also became conditioned by what Chogyam Trungpa spoke of as spiritual materialism. Instead of seeking at the material level, I was now seeking at the spiritual level, seeking for enlightenment. Part of this non-dual recognition was, in a sense, the extinguishing, the alleviation of that sense of seeking outside of what is right here. I've been seeking through spiritual practices for an ultimate experience. And the letting go of that seeking comes with that non-dual recognition that is sometimes described as knowing ourselves as awareness. You could talk of this journey or this recognition as a remembrance or a returning to presence. Knowing myself as awareness is knowing myself as this presence. This awareness is not something contained by my mind. It is the field, the wholeness in which I am a manifestation as form. So this presence does not have borders. It is the nature of what I am and what is. I want to name that in my experience, this seemed to be, you could say, what some people describe as the end of the path. There is no more seeking. There is this recognition. And as is spoken of in Zen, there is realization, and then there is actualization. What I feel is that we are at a point here in 2023 where this realization of knowing ourselves as presence, which we could also say knowing ourselves as love, that insight, that understanding is becoming more and more accessible to more and more people. I won't go into the reasons why or the various ways that I have come to that belief that this is becoming more and more accessible, more and more realized. Now, the challenge is, how do we actualize that? What do we do with that knowing? This, to me, is the interesting, juicy territory. And also, I feel, the territory where there is less emphasis. Part of what is challenging is that for each of us, I believe, that actualization, that integrating realization into form is going to be unique to us. So in a sense, we can't just go to a teacher and say, tell me what to do now, because we have to come to terms with that own insight for ourselves. This is what Carl Jung would call individuation. How are we individuating the divine? I think the Eastern spiritual traditions have a really strong focus on this returning to presence, this knowing ourselves as presence. I think the Western spiritual traditions, the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, have a really strong focus on what we could call being in relationship with the divine. Now, you would also find this strongly in the Hindu, the Indian traditions too, in devotional practices, for example. For me, with discovering the practice of ally work, all of a sudden, there was now a new dimension to presence. It wasn't just being as this presence, and yes, expressing as this presence too, as part of my individuation. But there was a real concrete way to be in relationship with this presence. And this is this term that arose for me, relational presence. How do we not just know ourselves as this presence? How do we activate, individuate this knowing through this relational, dynamic, dialogical encounter with presence? In a sense, it's a coming home to some of the, you could say, characteristics that have been so embedded in these Abrahamic traditions, relational orientations to the divine, that I had no living connection to through my cultural and family upbringing as an English person in the late 20th century. Those traditions did not feel alive to me. So I think one beautiful thing that ally work can do is to, let's say, heal or restore some of our appreciation for those traditions, and maybe to find the gems within them. Whereas we may have been, some of us may have been so focused on the problems of those traditions and the places where they lacked that presence. They've lost touch with that presence because they've been so focused on, let's say, institutional, authoritarian structures in how they're inviting people into a relationship to presence, to the divine. So ally work, in a sense, is a healing form. It's a healing practice. It's a restorative practice. Now, I'm very excited about this possibility of this move from presence to relational presence. And it's not just what I have been referring to, a re-encountering of these Western traditions. It is a new and fresh engagement from our very personal connection with relational presence. We can find deep learnings for these within the traditions, but we also are encountering presence freshly through our own unique facing of it, our own unique being in dialogue with it. So for those of you who have found deep healing and meaning in practices of presence, but may not have encountered how to relationalize this presence, for those of you who have found deep meaning in practices of presence and are seeking to actualize that understanding in your life, I invite you to explore this practice of ally work as a way to bring that relational dynamic into your deep valuing of presence. Thank you for your interest in these explorations.